The courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to the teenage girl standing behind the defendant's table. She was tiny compared to the judge's imposing desk, her oversized blazer swallowing her small frame. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a stack of papers. The judge leaned forward, his gavel resting in his hand. A mocking smirk crept across his face. "You mean to tell me," the judge began, his voice dripping with condescension, "that you, a child, intend to defend yourself in my court?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Lawyers exchanged incredulous glances. Spectators whispered behind their hands. The girl didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Yes, Your Honor," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. "I believe I have the right to a fair trial, whether I'm represented by a lawyer or myself." The judge laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of someone who thought he was watching a spectacle. He leaned back in his chair, twirling his gavel in his hand. "Well then, young lady," he said, his voice oozing sarcasm, "let's see what you've got. This should be entertaining." But as the girl began to speak, laying out her defense, the smirks disappeared. The whispers stopped. One by one, jaws dropped. She spoke with clarity and precision, presenting her arguments like a seasoned attorney. Evidence was presented. Points were countered. By the time she finished her opening statement, the courtroom was dead silent, the judge's face a mix of shock and discomfort. How did a teenage girl end up here? Alone in a courtroom, defending herself against an army of experienced lawyers? To understand, we must go back to where it all began. 2 months earlier, Emma Dawson was an ordinary 16-year-old living in the small town of Maple Creek. She loved sketching in her notebook, reading mystery novels, and hanging out with her best friend, Mia. Life was simple, almost boring, until the day everything changed. It was a bright Saturday morning when Emma's mother, a kind and quiet woman, was arrested. The charges? Embezzlement and fraud. Emma's world turned upside down in an instant. She didn't understand what was happening. Her mother was dragged out of their house in handcuffs, police cars flashing red and blue lights in their driveway. "Mom!" Emma shouted, running after her. "What's going on? What are they saying you did?" Her mother, tears streaming down her face, turned back to her. "Emma, it's a mistake," she said. "I didn't do anything. I swear. Take care of yourself. I'll explain everything soon." But soon never came. Emma's mother was denied bail. Within days, the news spread like wildfire through Maple Creek. Everyone had an opinion. Some believed her mother was guilty. Others whispered about her family's finances and speculated about hidden motives. Emma couldn't escape the stares, the gossip, the pointed fingers. Emma tried to stay strong, but it was overwhelming. When she visited her mom in jail, her mom looked more broken every time. The lawyers assigned to her case seemed uninterested, brushing off Emma's questions and urging her mom to take a plea deal. "Your mother's looking at 20 years if this goes to trial," one lawyer told her bluntly. "She could get out in 5 if she just pleads guilty." "But she's not guilty," Emma argued. "Why would she say she did something she didn't do?" The lawyer sighed, gathering his papers. "Sometimes, it's not about the truth. It's about what's easier." Emma couldn't accept that. She stayed up late, poring over documents and case files her mom's lawyers didn't bother to explain. She read legal articles online, trying to make sense of terms like burden of proof and chain of custody. The more she learned, the angrier she became. Her mom was being railroaded, and no one seemed to care. One night, Emma overheard a conversation between her mom and the lead lawyer during a jail visit. The lawyer was dismissive, talking about closing the case quickly so he could move on to another. "Mom," Emma said once the lawyer had left, "you have to fire him." Her mother gave her a tired smile. "Sweetheart, I can't afford anyone else. He's all we've got." Emma hesitated. She'd been harboring an idea for weeks, but it felt absurd. Impossible. Yet, as the days passed and she saw how little anyone cared, the idea grew until it became the only option. "What if I did it?" she blurted out one night at the jail. "What if I defended you?" Her mom blinked, stunned. "Emma, you're a kid." "I know. But I've been reading about this. I've seen all the files. I understand the evidence better than those lawyers do." "They don't care, Mom." "But I do." Her mom shook her head. "Sweetheart, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is serious. It's not a school debate." Emma didn't back down. "Mom, if we leave it to them, you'll go to prison for something you didn't do. You always told me to fight for what's right, no matter what. Let me fight for you." Her mother stared at her, torn. After a long silence, she whispered, "I'll think about it." The next day, Emma visited the courthouse and requested the forms to become her mother's legal representative. The clerk raised an eyebrow, but handed them over. Over the next week, Emma worked tirelessly to prepare, gathering evidence, studying case law, and preparing arguments. Her mom was reluctant, but Emma's determination wore her down. And now, here she was, standing in a courtroom, facing a judge who thought she was a joke. The courtroom held its breath as Emma wrapped up her opening statement. Even the opposing lawyers looked unsettled. The judge, his mocking tone gone, leaned forward. "That was unexpected," he said slowly. "But you've only just begun. Let's see if you can keep this up." Emma adjusted her glasses and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I intend to." But as the prosecution began their opening arguments, Emma realized just how steep the uphill battle would be. The lead prosecutor, a sharp and seasoned attorney named Mr. Franklin, wasted no time tearing into her mother's character. He painted a picture of greed and deception, backed by a mountain of supposed evidence. Emma's heart pounded as she listened. The first witness was called to the stand, Emma's mom's former co-worker, who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior. As Emma prepared her cross-examination, she felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. The judge's eyes bore into her. The jury's faces were a mix of skepticism and pity. "Miss Dawson," the judge said, "you may begin your cross-examination." Emma stood, clutching her notes. Her palms were sweaty, her knees shaky. But as she opened her mouth, something surprising happened. Her fear melted away. She had prepared for this. She knew the truth, and she was about to prove it. Emma adjusted her glasses, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. The courtroom seemed to grow quieter with each step, the air heavy with doubt and anticipation. She reached the podium and glanced up at the witness, a middle-aged man named Mr. Carter. He sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact with Emma as he nervously adjusted his tie. "Mr. Carter," Emma began, her voice steady but firm, "you testified that you witnessed my mother acting suspiciously at work. Can you describe exactly what you mean by suspiciously?" Mr. Carter cleared his throat, looking to the prosecutor for reassurance. "Well, I saw her staying late in the office. She'd be typing things into the computer and printing out documents. It seemed unusual." Emma tilted her head. "Staying late? Do you mean working overtime?" Yes, I suppose." "And did you ever think to ask her what she was working on?" Emma pressed. "Well, no," he admitted. "It wasn't my place." Emma nodded thoughtfully, pretending to consider his answer. Then she picked up a document from the stack on her table and held it up for the court to see. "This is a copy of the office attendance log from the past year," she said, handing a copy to the judge and the prosecutor. "According to this, Mr. Carter, you stayed late at work 37 times last year. My mother stayed late 41 times. Would you call your own behavior suspicious?" Mr. Carter's face turned red. "That's different," he stammered. "I wasn't." Emma didn't let him finish. "Let's talk about those documents you mentioned. The ones my mother printed. Did you ever see what was on them?" "No," he admitted. "But, so, you have no idea whether those documents were related to work or not?" "Well, no." Emma paused, letting the silence linger. The tension in the room was palpable. Then she turned to the jury, her voice clear and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Carter's testimony boils down to speculation. He didn't see anything illegal. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't even know what my mother was working on. Suspicion is not evidence, and it's certainly not proof." The judge raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. "You've made your point, Miss Dawson. You may step down, Mr. Carter." Emma returned to her seat, her heart pounding with adrenaline. She had won the first small battle, but she knew the war was far from over. The prosecution continued calling witnesses over the next few days, each one adding another layer to their narrative. A financial analyst claimed to have found discrepancies in the company's accounts, suggesting that funds had been funneled into a private account. A manager testified that Emma's mother had access to those accounts. And an IT specialist presented emails that seemed to implicate her mother in a scheme to manipulate the company's finances. Emma listened carefully, taking notes and analyzing every word. Some of the evidence seemed damning, but something about it didn't sit right with her. The emails, in particular, caught her attention. The wording felt off, formal, almost robotic, unlike the way her mother spoke or wrote. She stayed up late in her room, poring over the evidence. She compared the emails to one she had printed from her mom's personal account, noting differences in phrasing and tone. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that the emails had been fabricated. But how could she prove it? The trial reached a turning point when the prosecution called their star witness, Mr. Brent Hawkins, the company's CEO. He was a tall, imposing man with a commanding presence. He strode to the witness stand with confidence, his tailored suit and polished shoes exuding power. Mr. Franklin, the prosecutor, wasted no time. "Mr. Hawkins, can you tell the court about the financial irregularities you discovered?" "Certainly," Mr. Hawkins said. "Over the course of 6 months, we noticed small but consistent amounts of money disappearing from our accounts. At first, we thought it was a technical glitch, but after a thorough investigation, we traced the activity back to Mrs. Dawson's computer." "And what did you do next?" Franklin asked. "We confronted her. She denied everything, of course, but the evidence was clear. We had no choice but to terminate her employment and report the matter to the authorities." Emma's jaw clenched. She couldn't let this man paint her mother as a criminal without challenging him. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she stood up, her hand steady as she approached the witness stand. "Mr. Hawkins," she began, "you testified that the activity was traced to my mother's computer. Is that correct?" "Yes," he replied. "And was her computer ever examined for signs of tampering?" Mr. Hawkins hesitated. "I don't know the specifics. That was handled by our IT department." Emma pounced on the hesitation. "So, it's possible someone else could have accessed her computer, correct?" "Well, I suppose it's possible, but highly unlikely." "Unlikely is not impossible," Emma countered. She picked up another document from her table. "This is a report from your IT department, which I subpoenaed last week. It shows that multiple employees had access to the same network my mother used. Isn't that correct?" Mr. Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, but—" "No further questions," Emma said, cutting him off. She returned to her seat, her heart racing. The judge called for a recess, giving Emma a moment to breathe. That evening, Emma went back to her files, determined to find the smoking gun she needed. She combed through the emails again, cross-referencing timestamps and IP addresses. Finally, she found it, a series of emails sent from her mother's account while her mother was logged into a secure company system from a different location. It was impossible for her mom to have sent those emails. Emma ran to her mom's cell during visiting hours, her voice shaking with excitement. "Mom, I found it. Proof that someone set you up." Her mom's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Emma said, holding up the printouts. "I'm going to expose this in court." Her mom reached through the bars and squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you, Emma. But be careful. People like Mr. Hawkins don't play fair." Emma nodded, a flicker of doubt creeping into her mind. Was she poking a bear? She shook it off. The truth was on her side, and she wasn't backing down. The next day in court, Emma prepared to present her findings. But just as she was about to stand, Mr. Franklin interrupted. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to submit new evidence," he said, holding up a thick envelope. Emma froze as the judge examined the envelope, then nodded. "Very well. Proceed." Franklin opened the envelope and pulled out a series of photographs. They showed Emma's mother sitting in a car with a man in a suit, a briefcase between them. The prosecutor turned to the jury. These photos were taken 2 weeks before the alleged embezzlement began. The man in the photos is a known corporate fraudster. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not the behavior of an innocent woman. The courtroom erupted. Emma's mother looked devastated, her face pale. Emma stared at the photos, her mind racing. This was an ambush, a calculated move to throw her off balance. The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Emma stood, her voice firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to review this new evidence." The judge frowned, but nodded. "Granted. Court is adjourned until tomorrow." Emma sat back down, her heart pounding. The prosecution had just raised the stakes, and she knew the next round would be the most dangerous yet. Emma sat in the dimly lit library of the courthouse, her head buried in her hands. The photographs had rattled her. She knew her mother was innocent, but the prosecution's move had put doubt in everyone's minds, including her own. Who was the man in the pictures? Why hadn't her mom told her about him? And what was in that briefcase? "Think, Emma, think," she whispered to herself, her fingers tracing the edges of the photos. There had to be an explanation, something she was missing. She pulled out her notebook and began jotting down every question that came to mind, hoping to piece together the puzzle. After an hour of digging through case files and notes, she had an idea. The man in the photos was described by the prosecution as a known corporate fraudster. If that were true, there should be records of his past crimes. Emma grabbed her laptop and started searching online databases, combing through articles, court documents, and anything else she could find. Finally, she found him, Richard Grayson, a former consultant who had been implicated in multiple financial schemes but had avoided jail time by cutting deals with prosecutors. He was known for working with companies to manipulate their finances and frame low-level employees for embezzlement. Emma's heart raced as she read further. Could Grayson have been working with Mr. Hawkins? Was her mother just another scapegoat in one of his elaborate schemes? She needed proof. And fast. The next day, Emma returned to court with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent the entire night preparing her strategy, even calling Mia to help her draft subpoenas for records related to Grayson's activities. But as she walked into the courtroom, she was met with an icy glare from Mr. Franklin. "Miss Dawson," he said, approaching her table. "You're quite the little investigator, aren't you?" Emma ignored him, focusing on organizing her papers. But Franklin wasn't done. "Let me give you some advice," he said, leaning in closer. "You're playing with fire. Drop this nonsense about Richard Grayson, or you'll regret it." Emma looked up, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "Is that a threat, Mr. Franklin?" He smirked. "It's a reality check." Before Emma could respond, the judge entered the courtroom, signaling the start of the day's proceedings. Emma clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to be intimidated. The first order of business was the photographs. Emma stood to address the court. "Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the photographer who took these pictures." The judge nodded. "Very well. Bring the witness forward." A man in his early 30s stepped up to the stand, clutching a camera bag. He introduced himself as a private investigator hired by the prosecution. "Mr. Daniels," Emma began, "you testified that you took these photos. Can you confirm the exact date and time they were taken?" Daniels glanced at his notes. "March 12th, around 3 p.m. Emma nodded. "And where were you positioned when you took them?" "Across the street from the parking lot." "Interesting," Emma said, picking up one of the photos. "Because this picture shows the car facing the sun, which sets in the west. But according to weather records from that day, it was overcast with no direct sunlight. How do you explain that?" Daniels shifted in his seat. I don't know. Maybe the lighting. Or maybe these photos were doctored," Emma said, her voice rising. "Isn't it true that altering photos is a simple process for someone with your expertise?" The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Daniels looked to Mr. Franklin for help, but the prosecutor remained silent, his jaw clenched. "I'm not saying they were doctored," Daniels stammered. "But—" "No further questions," Emma said, returning to her seat. She had planted the seed of doubt. Now it was time to build on it. During the next recess, Emma approached the clerk's office to check on the subpoenas she had filed the night before. To her relief, the records had arrived. She quickly scanned them, her eyes widening as she found what she was looking for: emails between Richard Grayson and Brent Hawkins, discussing a restructuring plan for the company. The language was vague but pointed, with phrases like eliminating liabilities and containing fallout. This was the smoking gun she needed. When the trial resumed, Emma called Mr. Hawkins back to the stand. He looked annoyed but composed, his confidence unshaken. Mr. Hawkins, Emma began, holding up the emails, are you familiar with Richard Grayson? Hawkins' expression darkened. I've met him, yes. And would you say you had a professional relationship with him? Not particularly, Hawkins said carefully. He offered consulting services to our company, but we declined. Emma raised an eyebrow. Really? Because these emails suggest otherwise. She handed copies of the emails to the judge, jury, and prosecution. Hawkins' face paled as he read them. These messages discuss a restructuring plan for your company, Emma continued. Specifically, they mention eliminating liabilities. Can you explain what that means? Hawkins swallowed hard. I don't recall these emails. Emma stepped closer, her voice sharp. Do you deny sending them? I'm saying I don't remember, Hawkins said, his voice rising. And even if I did, they don't prove anything. Emma turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, these emails, combined with Mr. Grayson's history of fraud, paint a clear picture. My mother was set up to take the fall for a financial scheme orchestrated by Mr. Hawkins and Mr. Grayson. The so-called evidence against her is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. The jury looked visibly shaken. Even the judge seemed taken aback by Emma's boldness. As court adjourned for the day, Emma felt a surge of hope. She had delivered a powerful blow to the prosecution's case, but she knew the battle wasn't over. Mr. Franklin wouldn't go down without a fight. Sure enough, as Emma left the courthouse, she noticed a black car idling at the curb. The window rolled down, revealing a man in a dark suit. Miss Dawson, he said, his voice smooth and cold. A word of advice. Stay out of things you don't understand. Emma's stomach twisted, but she refused to show fear. Is that another threat? Call it a warning, the man said. You're in over your head, little girl. The car sped off, leaving Emma shaken but more determined than ever. Whoever these people were, they were scared, and that meant she was getting close to the truth. The next morning, Emma's alarm blared, but she was already awake, replaying the encounter with the man in the black car. His words were etched in her mind. You're in over your head. She shook off the lingering fear. If they were trying to scare her, it meant she was making progress. But she also knew she had to be smarter. One wrong move, and her mother could lose everything. Emma packed her notes and headed to court. As she walked through the doors, she spotted Mia sitting in the back row. Her best friend gave her a thumbs up, mouthing, "You've got this." It was the boost Emma needed to face the mounting pressure. The courtroom buzzed with tension as everyone took their seats. Today would be pivotal. The prosecution was expected to present their final witnesses, and Emma knew she had to dismantle their case before she presented her own. The first witness of the day was Mr. Franklin himself. The judge allowed the prosecutor to take the stand to clarify the origin of the photographs. Emma's gut twisted. This was a bold and strategic move. Franklin was a seasoned attorney, and putting himself on the stand was a way to control the narrative. Mr. Franklin, the defense attorney began, can you tell the court how these photographs were obtained? Franklin nodded confidently. Of course. Our office hired a private investigator, Mr. Daniels, to follow Mrs. Dawson after suspicions arose about her activities. And you were involved in the process of verifying the photographs' authenticity, the attorney pressed. Yes. I personally reviewed them to ensure they were unaltered and accurate, Franklin replied, his tone steady. Emma watched him closely, her pen tapping against her notebook. Something about his answer felt rehearsed. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the stand with caution. Mr. Franklin, she began, you testified that you reviewed the photographs personally. Can you tell us what steps you took to verify their authenticity? Franklin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I examined the metadata and cross-checked the timestamps. And did you conduct this analysis yourself? Emma asked, tilting her head. Franklin hesitated. No, I had an assistant handle the technical aspects. Emma nodded. So, you relied on someone else's assessment to verify the photographs. Is that correct? Yes, but... Thank you, Mr. Franklin, Emma said, cutting him off. No further questions. As she returned to her seat, she caught the judge's gaze. He seemed intrigued, perhaps even impressed by her composure. But Emma knew she needed more than just small victories. She needed a knockout punch. The prosecution rested their case after Franklin's testimony, and the judge called for a lunch break before the defense could begin. Emma used the time to strategize. She had planned to call her mother to the stand, but now she wasn't sure. The prosecution would rip her apart, and any hesitation could hurt their case. Instead, Emma decided to call Richard Grayson as a witness. It was a gamble, but one she hoped would pay off. When court resumed, Emma stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defense calls Richard Grayson to the stand." A murmur spread through the courtroom as Grayson entered. He was impeccably dressed, his demeanor cool and detached. He took the oath and sat down, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Grayson," Emma began, "you were employed as a consultant for Mr. Hawkins' company, correct?" "Yes," he replied smoothly. "And what was the nature of your work?" "I was brought in to evaluate financial systems and provide recommendations for improving efficiency." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Recommendations like embezzlement?" Grayson's eyes narrowed. "I don't appreciate the accusation." "It's not an accusation," Emma said, holding up the emails. "These messages between you and Mr. Hawkins suggest otherwise. Can you explain why you referred to eliminating liabilities?" Grayson shifted in his seat, his polished facade beginning to crack. It was a figure of speech. "We were discussing streamlining operations." Emma nodded, pretending to accept his answer. Then she delivered her next question like a hammer blow. "Mr. Grayson, are you aware that the emails you sent were traced to an IP address registered to a hotel across town from your usual office? Specifically, a location near where the photographs of my mother were taken." Grayson's jaw tightened. "I don't recall." Emma leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You don't recall orchestrating a scheme to frame my mother for your crimes? You don't recall meeting with Mr. Hawkins to discuss how to shift the blame?" "That's ridiculous," Grayson snapped, his calm exterior shattered. "Is it?" Emma said, her voice rising. "Because your history says otherwise. You've been implicated in multiple cases of fraud. You cut deals to avoid prison. And now you're trying to do it again, aren't you?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Grayson looked to Franklin, who avoided his gaze. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. "I have nothing further," Emma said, returning to her seat. She glanced at the jury, noting their reactions. Some looked skeptical, but others seemed convinced. It was a start. After court adjourned for the day, Emma lingered in the hallway, reviewing her notes. She had made progress, but there was still a long way to go. As she packed up, she noticed a man in a gray hoodie watching her from across the lobby. He quickly turned away when she looked at him, disappearing into the crowd. Emma's heart raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She hurried outside, scanning the street for any sign of the man. But the sidewalk was bustling with people, and he was nowhere to be seen. As she reached her car, she found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Emma stared at the note, her mind racing. The threats were getting bolder, and whoever was behind them wasn't bluffing. But instead of scaring her, the note only fueled her determination. They were trying to silence her because they knew she was close to uncovering the truth. Emma stuffed the note into her pocket and drove home, her thoughts racing. Tomorrow, she would present her final witnesses and deliver her closing arguments. The stakes were higher than ever, but Emma wasn't about to back down. Emma barely slept that night. The note left on her car replayed in her mind, each word burning brighter than the last. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." She knew they were watching her, but fear only strengthened her resolve. If they were desperate enough to intimidate her, then she was dangerously close to the truth. The next morning, she arrived at the courthouse with her head held high, determined to see this through. Today was her turn to present her case, and she planned to make every second count. The courtroom was unusually quiet as the judge called the session to order. The prosecution had been caught off guard by Emma's cross-examinations and her relentless pursuit of evidence, and the jury seemed increasingly skeptical of their narrative. But Emma knew she had to deliver something irrefutable to win them over completely. "Your Honor," Emma said, rising from her seat, "the defense would like to call Brent Hawkins to the stand." The room shifted as Hawkins stood and approached the witness stand. His confidence from earlier in the trial had faded, replaced by a guarded unease. He adjusted his tie as he was sworn in, avoiding Emma's gaze. "Mr. Hawkins," Emma began, her voice steady, "you testified earlier that you had no direct involvement with Richard Grayson beyond preliminary discussions. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Hawkins replied tersely. "And yet," Emma said, holding up the email she had introduced earlier, "these messages show detailed exchanges between you and Mr. Grayson about a restructuring plan. Do you deny writing these emails?" Hawkins hesitated, his jaw tightening. "No, I don't deny writing them. But as I said before, they were about streamlining operations, nothing illegal." Emma nodded, as though considering his response. Then she took a deep breath and pulled out her ace. "Mr. Hawkins, do you recognize this document?" she asked, holding up a printed ledger. Hawkins frowned, leaning forward to look at it. "It's a financial report." "Specifically," Emma clarified, "it's an internal financial report from your company, showing discrepancies in the accounts you claimed my mother embezzled from. But here's the interesting part. The discrepancies started 3 weeks before my mother even had access to those accounts. Can you explain that?" The jury's attention sharpened. Hawkins shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. I'd have to review the document to confirm its accuracy." "I'm sure you would," Emma said, her voice firm. "But it's already been authenticated. So I'll ask again. How could my mother have embezzled money from accounts she didn't even have access to?" Hawkins' face reddened. "I don't know. Maybe there's been a mistake. Or maybe," Emma said, stepping closer to the jury, "this was never about my mother. Maybe the real culprit needed a scapegoat to cover their tracks." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The judge banged his gavel for order, but Emma wasn't done. "Mr. Hawkins, isn't it true that you hired Richard Grayson specifically because of his expertise in financial manipulation? And isn't it true that the two of you orchestrated this scheme to frame my mother while you pocketed the stolen funds?" Hawkins glared at her, his composure unraveling. "That's absurd. I've done nothing wrong." Emma held up the emails again. "These messages say otherwise. And when paired with the financial records and Mr. Grayson's history, it's clear what really happened. You set my mother up." "I object," Mr. Franklin shouted, rising from his seat. "This is speculation, Your Honor." The judge turned to Emma. "Miss Dawson, do you have concrete evidence to back up this line of questioning?" Emma hesitated for a moment, then reached for her final piece of evidence. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She handed a USB drive to the bailiff. This drive contains logs from the company's server, showing unauthorized access to the accounts in question. The IP address used matches one registered to Mr. Hawkins' personal device. The courtroom gasped. Hawkins looked as though he'd been struck. "That's a lie," he shouted. "She's lying." The judge raised his hand to silence him. "We'll have the evidence reviewed. For now, the witness may step down." Hawkins stormed off the stand, his face flushed with fury. Emma returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She had played her strongest cards, but the outcome was still uncertain. The court adjourned for a brief recess, and Emma stepped outside to catch her breath. Mia was waiting for her, practically vibrating with excitement. "You crushed it in there," Mia said, pulling Emma into a hug. Hawkins looked like he was about to explode. Emma smiled faintly. "It's not over yet. The jury still has to believe me." "They will," Mia said firmly. "You're amazing." Emma's smile faded as she glanced around, scanning the crowd. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The memory of the note and the man in the gray hoodie lingered in her mind. "Let's get back inside," she said, her voice tight. "I don't want to be out here too long." Mia nodded, sensing her unease, and they headed back into the courthouse. As court resumed, Emma prepared for her closing argument. She stood before the jury, her hands steady as she gripped the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is about more than just evidence. It's about justice. My mother is an honest, hard-working woman who has been framed for a crime she didn't commit. The real criminals, Brent Hawkins and Richard Grayson, have gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, but the truth is clear. They used my mother as a scapegoat to hide their own greed." Emma took a deep breath, meeting the eyes of each juror in turn. "This isn't just about clearing my mother's name. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law. Not CEOs. not seasoned criminals. No one. She returned to her seat, her heart hammering in her chest. The prosecution delivered their closing argument, doubling down on their narrative, but Emma could see the cracks forming. The jury was no longer fully convinced. As the judge dismissed the court for the day, Emma gathered her things and walked toward the exit. But as she reached the door, a hand grabbed her arm. She turned to see the man in the gray hoodie standing close, his face partially obscured. "You don't know what you're getting into," he hissed. "Walk away while you still can." Emma yanked her arm free, glaring at him. "I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," the man said. Then he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Emma shaken but resolute. She stepped outside, her resolve stronger than ever. No matter the risks, she would see this through to the end. The tension in the courtroom was nearly unbearable as the trial entered its final stages. Emma woke that morning with a mix of determination and dread, knowing today might determine whether her mother would walk free or spend years in prison. The threats she had received, the strange encounters, they only reinforced the stakes. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about standing up to corruption and proving that truth could prevail, even against powerful adversaries. When Emma arrived at the courthouse, the air felt different. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions at her. The trial had drawn local attention, and now the nation was watching. Everyone wanted to know how a teenage girl had managed to rattle seasoned prosecutors and expose a company's dark secrets. Emma ignored them, keeping her focus on what mattered. She had one more witness to call, a witness who could blow the case wide open. The courtroom was packed as the session began. Emma stood, her hands steady as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor," the defense calls Richard Grayson back to the stand. The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was almost audible disbelief. Grayson looked startled, but he quickly masked it with his usual composure. He strode to the stand with an air of confidence, clearly assuming Emma had nothing left to corner him with. But Emma had spent the previous night preparing for this moment. She had dug deeper into the server logs, cross-referenced timestamps, and uncovered something Grayson thought he had hidden. "Mr. Grayson," Emma began, "during your previous testimony, you denied having any role in framing my mother. Is that correct?" "That's correct," he said smoothly. "And you also testified that you were brought in solely as a consultant to evaluate financial systems." "Yes." Emma paused, letting the silence linger before pulling out a document. "Can you explain this contract, Mr. Grayson? The one that shows you were paid a substantial bonus for your role in implementing cost-saving measures, a term that coincides with the same period the alleged embezzlement occurred." Grayson's calm facade faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "That's a standard performance bonus." "Is it?" Emma pressed, holding up another document. "Because this internal memo suggests otherwise. It outlines a plan to reduce exposure by placing liability on an employee who had no direct access to key accounts. And your name is on this memo." Grayson shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. "I wasn't involved in drafting that memo." Emma's eyes bore into his. "But you received a copy of it, didn't you?" Grayson hesitated, glancing at the jury. "I don't recall." "Then let me refresh your memory," Emma said, handing a copy of the memo to the judge. "This document was retrieved from the company's server. It was sent to your email address and opened on your computer. Would you like to explain why?" The tension in the room was palpable. Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it, his face pale. Emma seized the moment. "Mr. Grayson, isn't it true that you conspired with Brent Hawkins to frame my mother? That you fabricated evidence to make her appear guilty, all while covering up your own theft?" Grayson's voice cracked as he snapped, "This is ridiculous. You're just a kid playing lawyer. You don't know how this works." The judge pounded his gavel. "Order in the court." Emma didn't back down. "You're right, Mr. Grayson. I'm just a kid. But I know the truth. And so does the jury." Grayson glared at her, but he said nothing. The silence was damning. After Grayson stepped down, Emma called her final witness, a forensic analyst she had hired using funds raised by a local community group. The analyst testified that the server logs Emma had introduced were authentic and that unauthorized access to the accounts in question had been traced to devices registered to Hawkins and Grayson. The prosecution scrambled to discredit the evidence, but their objections fell flat. The jury was riveted, their skepticism toward the defense replaced by mounting doubts about the prosecution's case. As the day's session ended, Emma left the courthouse feeling a rare flicker of hope. She had presented a strong case, and the jury seemed to be leaning in her favor. But the moment she stepped outside, her optimism was shattered. The same black car she had seen before was idling at the curb. This time, the driver didn't hide. A man in a suit stepped out, his face cold and impassive. He walked straight toward her, his presence exuding menace. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Walk away before it's too late." Emma swallowed hard but stood her ground. "I'm not afraid of you." The man smirked, a chilling expression. "You should be. This is bigger than you realize. Back off, or you and your mother will regret it." Emma's hands trembled, but she refused to show weakness. "Go ahead and try to scare me. I'm not stopping." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of thinly veiled anger. He leaned in closer. "You're going to wish you had listened." With that, he turned and got back into the car. Emma watched as it sped away, her heart pounding. The threats were escalating, and she knew the people behind them were running out of patience. But she also knew she was close, too close to quit now. That night, Emma sat in her room, reviewing every piece of evidence one more time. She double-checked her notes, her arguments, her strategies. Tomorrow, the trial would conclude, and the jury would deliberate. She needed to be ready for anything. As she finally crawled into bed, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. But even in her dreams, the threats lingered, and the weight of what she was fighting for pressed heavily on her. Tomorrow would decide everything. The courthouse was alive with a crackling energy as the final day of the trial began. The crowd of reporters outside had swelled, and the courtroom was standing room only. Everyone was eager to witness the climax of a trial that had captured the public's imagination. A teenage girl taking on seasoned prosecutors, powerful executives, and a system stacked against her. Emma entered the courtroom with her head high, carrying her carefully organized notes and a single USB drive, the centerpiece of her closing argument. Her mother smiled at her from the defendant's table, her expression a mix of pride and worry. This was it. Today would determine everything. The judge called the court to order, and the prosecution opened the day with their closing arguments. Mr. Franklin, ever the polished professional, began with a calm and measured tone. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, pacing in front of them, "we cannot let theatrics cloud the facts. The evidence against Mrs. Dawson is overwhelming. Financial records show money missing from her accounts. Witnesses testified to her suspicious behavior. And the photographs, unshakable proof, show her meeting with a known fraudster." He paused, his voice softening. "I understand the defense wants you to believe this is all a grand conspiracy. But the reality is much simpler. Mrs. Dawson made a mistake, and now she must face the consequences." Emma studied the jury as Franklin spoke. Some jurors nodded along with him, but others wore skeptical expressions. She knew she had to capitalize on that doubt. When Franklin finished, he sat down with a confident smirk, as if he'd just delivered the final blow. Emma stood, took a deep breath, and approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Emma began, "you've heard a lot of claims during this trial. Claims that paint my mother as a criminal, as someone who betrayed the trust of her employer and colleagues. But let's take a step back and look at the evidence." She held up the USB drive. "On this drive are the server logs that show unauthorized access to the accounts my mother supposedly embezzled from. These logs trace directly to devices owned by Brent Hawkins and Richard Grayson, the very people who accused my mother of this crime." Emma walked slowly in front of the jury, meeting their eyes one by one. "Ask yourselves this. Why would my mother need to access those accounts from someone else's computer? Why would she risk everything for money she didn't need or use? The answer is simple. She wouldn't. And she didn't." She placed the USB drive on the evidence table, then picked up the photographs that had been a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. "Now let's talk about these pictures. The prosecution claims they show my mother meeting with Richard Grayson to plan the embezzlement. But these photos don't tell the whole story." Emma turned to the jury, her voice firm. "We've proven that these photographs were staged. The lighting, the timing, the inconsistencies, they all point to one conclusion. These images were doctored to frame my mother." She paused, letting her words sink in. The courtroom was silent, the jury hanging on her every word. "But there's something else you should know," Emma said, her voice rising. "The man behind these photos, Richard Grayson, has a history of manipulating evidence and framing innocent people. He's done it before, and he's doing it again. The only difference this time is that he got caught." Emma turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a sworn affidavit from one of Mr. Grayson's former clients, who testifies to his role in a similar scheme 5 years ago." The judge accepted the document, and the jury visibly reacted, some leaning forward in their seats. Emma knew she had their attention. Emma ended her closing argument with an emotional appeal. "This trial isn't just about clearing my mother's name. It's about justice. It's about standing up to people who think they're too powerful to be held accountable. My mother didn't commit this crime. She's a scapegoat for the real criminals, Brent Hawkins and Richard Grayson. I trust you to see the truth and make the right decision." As she sat down, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Even the judge looked impressed, though he quickly restored order with a sharp rap of his gavel. The jury deliberated for hours. Emma sat with her mother in the hallway, the weight of the trial pressing down on her like a lead blanket. Mia stayed close, offering quiet words of encouragement, but Emma couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Finally, the bailiff emerged. "The jury has reached a verdict." Emma's heart pounded as they filed back into the courtroom. She clutched her mother's hand, her mind racing through every possible outcome. The judge addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, holding a small piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded the paper and cleared their throat. "In the case of the State versus Dawson, we find the defendant not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted in gasps and cheers. Emma's mother broke down in tears, pulling Emma into a tight embrace. "You did it," her mother whispered. "You saved me." Emma's own tears spilled over as relief washed through her. But amidst the celebration, she couldn't ignore the grim expression on Brent Hawkins' face as he was led away in handcuffs. Richard Grayson, too, was arrested on charges of perjury and fraud. The battle was won, but Emma knew the war against corruption was far from over. That night, Emma and her mother returned home to find the house filled with neighbors and friends, all eager to celebrate. Mia handed Emma a sparkling cider, grinning. "To the smartest, bravest lawyer I know," Mia said, raising her glass. Emma laughed, though her smile was bittersweet. The trial had taken a toll on her, and the threats she'd faced still lingered in her mind. But for now, she allowed herself to celebrate. Her mother was free, and the truth had prevailed. As the night wore on, Emma stepped outside to catch her breath. The cool night air was refreshing, but it also carried a sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was the man in the suit, the same one who had threatened her outside the courthouse. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You made enemies today, Emma. Powerful enemies." Emma straightened, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Good," she said. "Let them know I'm not afraid of them." The man smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You should be." Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Emma stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The aftermath of the trial brought relief but also unease. Emma's mother was free, the truth had prevailed, and the corrupt dealings of Brent Hawkins and Richard Grayson were finally exposed. Yet, Emma couldn't shake the sense that a storm was still brewing. The man's ominous warning haunted her thoughts. "You made enemies today. Powerful enemies." Life returned to a semblance of normalcy for a few weeks. Emma and her mom tried to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of the trial loomed large. Reporters continued to hound them, their faces plastered across newspapers and TV screens. Emma was hailed as a legal prodigy, but she felt far from invincible. She knew the kind of people she had challenged didn't go down quietly. One crisp autumn morning, Emma's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello, Miss Dawson," the voice on the other end said, smooth and cold. "I think it's time we met in person." Emma's stomach dropped. She recognized the voice. It was the man from the courthouse. Her grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want?" she demanded. "A chance to talk," he said calmly. "You've stirred up a lot of trouble, and it's in everyone's best interest to resolve this quietly." "I'm not interested," Emma snapped, her voice firm. "Careful," he said, his tone darkening. "Refusing this invitation might be a mistake." The line went dead before Emma could respond. Her heart raced as she stared at her phone. Whoever this man was, he wasn't giving up. That afternoon, Emma decided to visit Detective Harper, the officer who had initially investigated her mother's case. Harper had been skeptical of Emma's theory at first, but eventually became an ally, providing access to key evidence that helped win the trial. If anyone could help her now, it was him. Harper greeted her with a weary smile when she arrived at his office. "Emma, I was wondering when I'd hear from you again." "I need your help," Emma said, sitting down across from him. "Someone's threatening me. I think it's connected to the trial." Harper's expression grew serious. "Threatening you how?" Emma recounted the encounters with the man in the suit and the phone call she'd received that morning. Harper listened intently, his brow furrowed. "This isn't surprising," he said when she finished. "Exposing people like Hawkins and Grayson creates ripples. You didn't just challenge them, you exposed their entire network. Whoever's behind these threats is likely tied to that network." Emma nodded. "But why come after me now? The trial is over. They've lost." "Not entirely," Harper said grimly. "Hawkins and Grayson are just the tip of the iceberg. If you keep digging, you could uncover a lot more. And that's what they're afraid of." Emma's mind raced. She had suspected there was more to the story, but hearing it confirmed was chilling. "So what do I do?" Harper leaned back in his chair, thinking. "You've got two choices. Keep your head down and hope they leave you alone, or keep fighting." Emma didn't hesitate. "I'm not backing down." Harper nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Then you'll need protection. I'll pull some strings and see what I can arrange. In the meantime, stay vigilant. These people don't play fair." That evening, Emma returned home to find her mother waiting in the living room, her face pale and worried. "Emma," she said, holding up a letter. "This was in the mailbox." Emma took the letter, her hands trembling as she opened it. The message was typed, the words cold and menacing. "This is your last warning. Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Enclosed with the letter was a photograph of Emma leaving Detective Harper's office earlier that day. Her blood ran cold. "How did they?" she began, but her mother cut her off. "Emma, you need to stop this," her mother pleaded. "It's too dangerous." "I can't," Emma said, her voice trembling but resolute. "If I stop now, they win. They'll keep doing this to other people." Her mother looked at her with tears in her eyes. "I can't lose you, Emma. Please." Emma hugged her tightly. "You won't lose me, Mom. I promise. But I can't let them scare me into silence." Determined to get to the bottom of the threats, Emma spent the next few days poring over every piece of evidence from the trial. She combed through the emails, financial records, and server logs, looking for anything she might have missed. It was during one of these late-night sessions that she found it, a name buried in the metadata of one of the emails, Jabe Wallace. The name wasn't familiar, but it was a lead. Emma immediately began searching online, piecing together a profile of a man who had been a silent partner in Hawkins' company. Wallace's name appeared in connection with several shell companies, each linked to financial fraud cases. It became clear that Wallace wasn't just an accomplice, he was one of the masterminds behind the entire operation. Emma leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If she could expose Wallace, it might unravel the entire network. But before she could make a plan, her laptop screen suddenly went black. A message flashed in bold red letters. "We warned you. Now you've crossed the line." Emma's stomach dropped as she realized what was happening. Her laptop had been hacked. She scrambled to disconnect it from the internet, but the damage was done. Her files were gone, wiped clean. She sat in stunned silence, the weight of the attack pressing down on her. This was no longer a game. The people she was up against were more dangerous than she'd imagined, and they were willing to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. But instead of scaring her, the attack only fueled her determination. She might have lost her files, but she hadn't lost her resolve. "Game on," she whispered to herself, her jaw set. "You're not going to get away with this." The message on Emma's blank laptop screen loomed in her mind long after the power had been shut off. "We warned you. Now you've crossed the line." They were escalating their threats, proving they could strike at any time. But Emma wasn't ready to fold. If anything, the attack confirmed she was getting too close to the truth for their comfort. She spent the night reconstructing her notes from memory, scribbling furiously in her notebook while her phone buzzed with calls from Mia and Detective Harper. She finally picked up Harper's call. "They wiped my files," she said before he could speak. Harper's sigh was heavy with concern. "I figured as much. I've been keeping tabs on their network activity since our meeting. Whoever you're up against isn't just skilled, they have deep resources." "So, what do we do?" Emma asked. "We find out who's pulling the strings," Harper said firmly. "But we have to be smart about this. If they're hacking your devices, they'll be watching your next moves. Let me dig into this Wallace character you mentioned. You focus on staying safe." Emma agreed, though she wasn't ready to sit idly by. She had already seen what inaction could cost her family. The next morning, she called Mia. "I need your help," Emma said. "Of course," Mia replied without hesitation. "What's the plan?" Emma explained that she suspected the Wallace lead was critical, but she needed to work quietly. "We need to dig up everything we can about Wallace without drawing attention. His finances, his connections, where he operates from, everything." Mia's excitement was palpable. "Consider it done." Emma and Mia worked from the public library for most of the day, using secure accounts and proxy servers to minimize their digital footprint. They uncovered a trail of shell companies tied to Wallace, each one leading to offshore accounts and suspiciously timed transfers. One transaction stood out, a transfer of millions of dollars just weeks before the trial began. The recipient, a private security firm known for handling unpleasant situations for high-profile clients. The firm's records were sealed, but its reputation was enough to make Emma's skin crawl. "This is it," Emma said, showing Mia the screen. "This is how they've been keeping tabs on me. They hired these guys to follow me, hack my devices, everything." Mia stared at the screen, her jaw tight. "And if they find out you know this?" Emma exhaled, her resolve unshaken. "Then we use it against them. If I can prove Wallace hired this firm to intimidate me, it ties him directly to the threats." But just as they started downloading the files, the computer screen flickered, and an error message appeared, "Unauthorized access detected." "Shut it down," Emma hissed, yanking the power cord. The computer went dark, but the damage was done. They had been spotted. That evening, Emma returned home to find Detective Harper waiting on her porch. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the digital footprint you left today?" he asked, arms crossed. "We found something," Emma said, leading him inside. "Wallace hired a private security firm to monitor me. It's all tied to his accounts." Harper nodded grimly. "And now they know you know. They'll tighten their grip." Emma's mother appeared in the doorway, her face etched with worry. "What's going on?" Emma hesitated, then turned to Harper. "We can't keep waiting for them to strike first. What's our next move?" Harper took a deep breath. "We go after Wallace directly. But we'll need more than just financial records. We need concrete evidence linking him to the threats, the hacking, and the fraud." Emma knew it was a long shot, but she also knew it was their only option. "How do we get it?" Harper's expression hardened. "We make him think you're backing down. If he believes the threat is neutralized, he might get sloppy." Emma frowned. "You want me to pretend I'm giving up?" "Exactly," Harper said. "But you won't actually stop. You'll just make it look like you have while we gather the evidence." Emma hated the idea of playing into Wallace's hands, but she saw the wisdom in Harper's plan. "Fine," she said. "But this has to work." The next morning, Emma posted a carefully worded message on her social media accounts, thanking everyone for their support and announcing that she and her mother were stepping back from the public eye to focus on healing. The post drew mixed reactions. Some praised her bravery, while others speculated that the threats had finally scared her into silence. Meanwhile, Harper worked behind the scenes to gather surveillance on Wallace. He used his connections to obtain a warrant for the private security firm's records, which revealed a series of encrypted messages between Wallace and its operatives. The messages detailed orders to apply pressure on Emma and eliminate any loose ends. It was damning evidence, but Harper needed one more piece to seal the case: proof that Wallace had orchestrated the fraud that led to the trial. That meant accessing his personal files, a task that required going directly to his estate. Late that night, Emma and Harper sat in his car outside Wallace's sprawling mansion. The security was tight, with guards patrolling the grounds and cameras covering every angle. "This is insane," Harper muttered, scanning the layout. "We'll never get in undetected." Emma, however, had been studying the security firm's practices. "They rely on predictable routines," she said, pointing to the side gate. "That patrol will shift in 5 minutes. That's our window." Harper stared at her, incredulous. "You've done this before?" "No," Emma admitted, "but I've read a lot of detective novels." Harper shook his head but followed her lead. Together, they slipped through the side gate, navigating the shadows toward the main house. Emma's heart pounded as they reached Wallace's office, her hands shaking as she typed the code she had deduced from his financial records. The door clicked open. Inside, Harper began rifling through files while Emma booted up Wallace's computer. She inserted a USB drive and started downloading everything she could find. "Hurry," Harper whispered. "We're running out of time." The computer screen flashed. "Download complete." Emma yanked the drive just as an alarm blared through the mansion. "Run!" Harper shouted. They sprinted out of the office, dodging guards as chaos erupted around them. By the time they reached the car, Emma's heart felt like it might burst. They peeled out of the driveway, leaving the mansion and Wallace's empire exposed. The following morning, Emma sat at Detective Harper's desk, staring at the USB drive they had risked everything to retrieve. It felt like the weight of the world was stored in that tiny device. Inside was their best shot at taking down Wallace and everyone connected to him. "This is it," Harper said, inserting the drive into his computer. "Let's see what we've got." Emma leaned forward as files popped up on the screen. There were emails, financial ledgers, encrypted messages, and documents detailing shell companies, fraudulent transfers, and blackmail schemes. One file stood out, a spreadsheet titled Liability Allocation. It contained a chillingly detailed plan to frame Emma's mother as a scapegoat for embezzlement. The document had been digitally signed by Wallace himself. "We've got him," Harper said, a grin breaking through his usual stoic expression. "This is enough to bury him." But Emma wasn't celebrating yet. "What about the security firm? The threats? We need to make sure everyone involved is held accountable." Harper nodded. "That's where this comes in." He opened a folder containing payment records linking Wallace to the private security firm. It included orders for surveillance on Emma and instructions to neutralize the threat she posed. "This is more than just corporate fraud," Harper said, his tone dark. "This is conspiracy, intimidation, and obstruction of justice. Once we turn this over to the FBI, they'll tear his entire operation apart." The takedown happened swiftly. Armed with the evidence from the USB drive, Harper coordinated with federal agents to raid Wallace's mansion. News of the raid broke within hours, and reporters swarmed the scene as Wallace and several of his associates were led out in handcuffs. Emma watched the coverage from her living room, her mother sitting beside her. The relief was palpable, but so was the exhaustion. Months of stress, fear, and uncertainty were finally coming to an end. "They're calling you a hero," her mother said, gesturing to the TV. "How does it feel?" Emma smiled faintly. "Like I need a nap." Her mother laughed for the first time in weeks, and Emma felt a wave of warmth. It wasn't just about winning, it was about getting her mother's life back. The aftermath of the trial and the raid brought sweeping changes. Wallace's empire crumbled as more victims came forward, emboldened by Emma's courage. Investigations revealed the extent of his corruption, implicating other executives, government officials, and even law enforcement officers who had turned a blind eye. The private security firm that had threatened Emma was shut down, its operatives facing charges of their own. And while the threats against Emma didn't completely disappear, they lessened significantly as Wallace's influence waned. Months later, Emma stood at a podium in a packed auditorium, addressing a crowd of aspiring young lawyers and activists. The local university had invited her to speak about her experience, and though she was nervous, she knew it was important to share her story. "My journey started because I refused to accept what people told me was inevitable," she said. They said my mom didn't stand a chance. They said the system was too big to fight. But I learned that the truth is powerful, if you're willing to fight for it. The audience erupted into applause, and Emma felt a swell of pride. She had gone from an ordinary teenager to someone who had changed the course of her mother's life, and exposed a network of corruption in the process. After her speech, Mia met her backstage, grinning. "You killed it out there." Emma laughed. "Thanks, but I think I'm retiring from public speaking. This was stressful." "Yeah, right," Mia teased. "You've got the law in your blood now. I wouldn't be surprised if you became a real lawyer someday." Emma shrugged, but a small smile tugged at her lips. "Maybe." That night, Emma sat on her porch, staring up at the stars. The weight of the past months had finally started to lift, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. Her phone buzzed with a message from Detective Harper. "We did it, kid. Justice served. Get some rest. You've earned it." Emma smiled as she typed back, "Thanks for believing in me." As she put her phone away, she realized that the journey had changed her forever. She wasn't just a teenager anymore. She was someone who had faced fear and refused to back down. And while the fight had been brutal, it had been worth it. Because in the end, the truth had won.